We're on a tight schedule because it's actually the launch of Heather's media tour for her new book, and we want her to make sure that she's prompt at her next appearance. So I will be brief. It's my pleasure to introduce today Judge Michael Mukasey. He's a graduate of Columbia University and Yale Law School. Early in his career, Judge Mukasey served as the Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York and as Chief of the Official Corruption Unit. From 1988 to 2006, Judge Mukasey served as a district judge in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, becoming Chief Judge in 2000. During that time, he presided over several historical terrorism cases, including the trial of the so-called dirty bomber Jose Padilla and the first World Trade Center bombing with the Blind Sheik. In 2007, Judge Mukasey was appointed by President George W. Bush as the 81st Attorney General of the United States, and as it turned out, one of the greatest people to serve in that office in our history. That's my opinion. He is the recipient of several awards, most notably the Learned Hand Medal of the Federal Bar Council. Today, Judge Mukasey is a counsel at the prestigious international law firm DeVois and Plimpton, and he continues to speak out on important legal and criminal justice issues, and a frequent op-ed writer for the Wall Street Journal. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Judge Michael Mukasey.
I want to thank Larry Moan for that lovely introduction, but principally for the privilege of what I'm about to do. We seem to be turning from a Western society into a Middle Eastern one, and I can still recall when political arguments were pretty much resolved by facts. There was such a thing as objective truth. Things do, after all, happen one way and one way only, and if you could show that the facts supported your position, then you won the argument. No more. Our political discussions now sound as if they are taking place in the Middle East. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with a website called MEMRI, M-E-M-R-I, the Middle East Media Research Institute. It's free, and they send you often daily, sometimes a couple of times a day, translations of articles or segments of media broadcasts from the Middle East. And what's most characteristic of them, what's becoming most characteristic of our society, is that the regular resort to myth. For example, one durable and persistent myth in the Middle East is that either Israel or the United States perpetrated the 9/11 attacks. And an equally durable and persistent myth in the United States has become that minority people in general, and blacks in particular, are being slaughtered by the police, and that the police need to be reined in and punished. In this setting, we need someone who can help those of us who would like this to remain a Western society, and one worth living in, by giving us facts to use in the battle. Luckily, when it comes to the issue of law enforcement, we have such a person. In her latest book, The War on Cops, Heather McDonald lays out in painstaking and often painful detail the fraudulent statistics that underlay the litigation that has hamstrung the stop and frisk program in New York, what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, what the effect of the myths surrounding Ferguson has been on law enforcement, how that effect was magnified in Baltimore and magnified yet again in New York. As you can tell from the title of her book, the thesis is that there is a war being waged against police in the courts, in the press, and in the streets, and that the effects of it are being felt not only by the police, but also by the citizenry at large, which is less safe as a result. The only way to fight that is with facts, and Heather McDonald arms the rest of us with those facts. Now, it may be something of a rhetorical device, but I don't think it's much of an exaggeration, if it is one at all, to refer to a presidential speech that took place back at the time when presidential speeches were worth listening to. That's longer ago than many people in this room remember. Specifically, FDR's Arsenal of Democracy speech in 1940, when he talked about the necessity of this country being the great arsenal of democracy to help defend Western civilization. I draw an analogy between that and Heather's book. She arms us with facts, just as we armed the rest of the world, or the Western world, when they were under attack by the Axis powers. Well, we're under siege right now from within by political charlatans street demonstrators such as the Black Lives Matter movement, and leaders who have virtually abdicated their public responsibilities. So in this setting, I'm proud to introduce, and I think you will be encouraged to hear from, a modern-day, one-woman arsenal of democracy, Heather McDonald.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Mukasey. I am utterly honored by such generous words from someone who, in keeping America safe, has never hesitated to name the enemy, unlike our current leaders. As we are seeing today, there are powerful and dangerous taboos at play in national security, and they exist in local law enforcement as well. I also want to thank the editors at City Journal, Brian Anderson, Paul Beston, and Matthew Hennessy for their invaluable help with this book. For the last 2 years, a protest movement known as Black Lives Matter has convulsed the nation. Triggered by the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014, the Black Lives Matter movement holds that racist officers are the greatest threat facing young black men today. This belief has triggered riots, die-ins, the murder and attempted murder of police officers, and a campaign to eliminate traditional grand jury proceedings when police use lethal force. Even though the U.S. Justice Department has resoundingly disproven the lie that a Pacific Michael Brown was shot in cold blood while trying to surrender, Brown is still venerated as a martyr. And now, officers are backing off of proactive policing under the relentless venom directed at them in the streets and in the media. As a result, violent crime is on the rise. The need is urgent, therefore, to examine the Black Lives Matter movement's central thesis, that the police are the greatest threat facing young black men today. I propose 2 counter hypotheses. First, that there is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the police. And second, that we have been talking obsessively about alleged police racism for the last 2 decades in order not to talk about a far larger problem, black-on-black crime. Now, let's be clear at the onset. Police have an indefeasible obligation to treat everyone with courtesy and respect and within the confines of the law. Too often, officers develop a hardened, obnoxious attitude. It is also the case that being stopped when you are innocent of any wrongdoing is infuriating, humiliating, and sometimes terrifying. And needless to say, every unjustified police shooting of an unarmed civilian is a stomach-churning tragedy. Given the appalling history of racism in this country and the complicity of the police in that history, police shootings of black men are particularly and understandably fraught. That history informs how many people view the police. But however intolerable and inexcusable every act of police brutality is, and while we need to make sure that the police are properly trained in the Constitution and in courtesy, there is a larger reality behind the issue of policing crime and race that remains a taboo topic. The problem of black-on-black crime is an uncomfortable truth, but unless we acknowledge it, we won't get very far in understanding patterns of policing. Every year, approximately 6,000 blacks are murdered. That is a number greater than the number of white and Hispanic homicide victims combined, even though blacks are only 13% of the nation's population. Blacks of all ages are killed at 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. In Los Angeles, a typical city, blacks between the ages of 20 and 24 die at a rate 20 to 30 times the national mean. Who is killing them? Not the police and not other whites, but blacks. The astronomical black death by homicide rate is a function of the black crime rate. Black males between the ages of 14 and 17 commit homicide at 10 times the rate of white and Hispanic male teens combined. Blacks of all ages commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. And if you remove Hispanics, the rate goes up to an 11 times difference. The percentage of blacks among civilians killed by the police, 26% in 2015, is far less than what the black crime rate would predict, since police shootings will occur most often in areas where cops are confronting violent, armed criminals and people resisting arrest. 40% of all cop killers over the last decade have been black males, even though black males are only 6% of the nation's population. Now, standard anti-cop ideology holds that law enforcement actions are racist if they don't mirror population data. New York City illustrates why that expectation is so misguided. Blacks are 23% of New York City's population, but they commit 75% of all shootings, 70% of all robberies, and 66% of all violent crime. Add Hispanic shootings, and you account for 98% of all illegal gunfire in the city. Whites are 33% of the city's population, but they commit fewer than 2% of all shootings, 4% of all robberies, and 5% of all violent crime. These disparities mean that virtually every time that the police in New York are called out on a gun run, meaning that someone has just been shot, they are being summoned to minority neighborhoods looking for minority suspects. Officers hope against hope that they will receive a description of a white shooting suspect for once, but it almost never happens. This incidence of crime means that innocent black men have a much higher chance of being stopped by the police because they match the description of a suspect than white men. The police do not wish this. It is a reality forced on them by the facts of crime. Now, who are some of the victims of elevated urban crime? On March 11th, 2015, as protesters were again converging on the Ferguson Police Department demanding the resignation of the entire department, a 6-year-old boy named Marcus Johnson was killed a few miles away in a St. Louis park, the victim of a drive-by shooting. No one protested his killing. Al Sharpton did not demand a federal investigation. Few people outside his immediate community even know his name. 10 children under the age of 10 were killed in Baltimore last year. In Cleveland, 3 children aged 5 or younger were killed in September alone of 2015. In November, a 9-year-old in Chicago was lured into an alley and assassinated by his father's gang enemies. The father refused to cooperate with the police. Such mindless violence seems almost to be regarded as normal, given the lack of attention it receives from the same people who would be out in droves if any of these victims had been shot by a police officer. As horrific as such shootings are, crime rates were much higher 20 years ago. In New York City in 1990, for example, there were 2,245 homicides. In 2014, there were 333, a drop of 85%. New York's crime drop is the steepest in the nation, but crime has fallen at a historic rate nationwide as well, by about 40% since the early 1990s. The greatest beneficiaries of that crime drop have been minorities. Over 10,000 minority males are alive today in New York who would have been dead if the city's homicide rate had remained at its early 1990s levels. What is behind this historic crime drop? A policing revolution that began in New York and spread nationally. Starting in 1994, the NYPD top brass embraced the then radical idea that the police can actually prevent crime, not just respond to it. They started obsessively gathering and analyzing crime data on a daily and then hourly basis. They looked for patterns and strategized on tactics to try to quell crime outbreaks as they were emerging. Equally importantly, they held commanders accountable for crime in their jurisdictions. Department leaders started meeting on a weekly basis with precinct commanders to grill them on crime patterns on their watch. These weekly accountability sessions came to be known as CompStat. They were ruthless, high-tension affairs. Chairs were thrown in some of these early meetings, so charged with this atmosphere of being held accountable for the first time. If a commander was not fully informed about every local crime outbreak and ready with a strategy to combat it, his career was in severe jeopardy. CompStat created a sense of urgency about crime fighting that has never left the NYPD. For decades, the rap against the police was that they ignored crime in minority neighborhoods. CompStat now keeps New York commanders focused like a laser beam on where people are most being victimized, and that is in minority communities. CompStat spread nationwide. Departments across the country now send officers to emerging crime hotspots to try to interrupt criminal behavior before it happens. No other government program has come close to data-driven policing success as an economic stimulus. In New York City, businesses that had shunned previously drug-infested areas now set up shop there, offering residents choice in shopping and creating a demand for workers. Senior citizens felt safe to go to the store, to the post office to pick up their Social Security check. Children could ride their bikes on city sidewalks without their mothers worrying that they would be shot. But the crime victories of the last 2 decades are now in jeopardy, thanks to the falsehoods of the Black Lives Matter movement. There are signs that law and order and the moral support for such order are breaking down. Police operating in inner-city neighborhoods now find themselves routinely surrounded by cursing, jeering crowds when they make a pedestrian stop or try to arrest a suspect. Sometimes bottles and rocks are thrown. Cops are worried about becoming the latest racist cop of the week and possibly losing their livelihood thanks to an incomplete cell phone video that inevitably fails to show the antecedents to their own use of force. Officer use of force is never pretty, but the public is clueless about how hard it is to subdue a suspect who is determined to resist arrest. As a result of the anti-cop campaign of the last 2 years and the resulting pushback in the streets, officers in urban areas are cutting back on precisely the self-initiated policing that led to the crime decline of the 1990s and 2000s. Arrests and summons are down, particularly for low-level offenses. Police officers continue to rush to 911 calls when there's already a victim. But when it comes to making that discretionary stop, getting out of their car and questioning someone hanging out at a known drug corner at 1 a.m., say, many cops are telling each other, you'd have to be crazy to put your career on the line for that. Cops are human. When they are repeatedly told that they are racist for stopping and questioning suspicious individuals in high crime areas, at some point, they will do less of those stops. That is both understandable and, in a sense, how it should work. Policing is political. If a powerful political bloc has denied the legitimacy of assertive policing, then we'll get less of it. But the people demanding that the police back off are by no means representative of the entire Black community. Go to any police community meeting in Harlem, the South Bronx, or South Central Los Angeles, and you will inevitably hear some variant of the following requests. We want the dealers off the corner. You arrest them and they're back the next day. There are kids hanging out on my stoop. Why can't you arrest them for loitering? I smell weed in my hallway. Can't you do something? I met an elderly cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who was terrified to go into her lobby to get her mail because of the youth hanging out there trespassing and selling drugs. The only time she felt safe was when the police were there. Please, Jesus, she told me, send more police. The irony is that the police cannot respond to these heartfelt requests for public order without generating the racially disproportionate statistics that will be used against them by the ACLU or the Justice Department. Unfortunately, when officers back off in high-crime areas, crime shoots through the roof. The country is in the midst of the first sustained violent crime spike in 2 decades. Murders rose 17% in the nation's 56 largest cities in 2015. And in 12 cities with large black populations, homicides were up a minimum of 50%. Let's put this in perspective, because the anti-cop left tries to minimize this crime increase by saying, no big deal, showing simply how ignorant they are about policing. If homicides had gone down 17% in 1 year, every police chief in this country would be popping champagne corks and high-fiving each other. Baltimore's per capita homicide rate last year was the highest in its history. Washington, D.C. ended 2015 with a 54% increase in murders. Minneapolis was up 61% in homicides. And in Chicago, where pedestrian stops are down by 90%, shootings were up 80% through March 2016. I first identified the violent crime increase in May 2015 and dubbed it the Ferguson effect. My diagnosis set off a firestorm of controversy on the anti-cop left and in criminology circles. Despite that furor, FBI Director James Comey has now twice confirmed the Ferguson effect and has promptly been rebuked by President Obama for doing so. The idea that President Obama knows more about crime and policing than his own FBI director is, of course, ludicrous. But Comey needed to be taken down because to recognize the connection between proactive policing and public safety undermines the entire premise of the anti-cop left. The overwhelming majority of victims in the current crime increase are, as usual, black, as are their assailants. But police officers are coming under attack as well. It turns out that police officers are at much greater risk from blacks than unarmed blacks are from police officers. Over the last decade, an officer's chance of getting killed by a black has been 18.5 times higher than the chance of an unarmed black getting killed by a police officer. I don't know what will end the current frenzy against the police. Hillary Clinton is continuing President Obama's race-based calumnies against the criminal justice system, arguing that American justice is shot through with racial bias. This claim is false and dangerous. Criminologists have spent decades trying and hoping to find evidence of such bias and have been forced to conclude that the disproportionate representation of blacks in prison is a function of their disproportionate crime rates, pure and simple. We have been here before. In the 1960s and early 1970s, black and white radicals regularly directed hatred and occasional violence against the police. The difference today is that anti-cop ideology is embraced at the highest reaches of the establishment by the president, his attorney general, college presidents, foundation heads, and the press. We are playing with fire, and if it keeps spreading, it will be hard to put out. Thank you for your attention.
All right, we have quite a bit of time for questions. We have one mic. Is there one mic? Okay, so just wait for me to acknowledge you. Just give us your name and then the question. We'll start right there with Gene.
Gene Epstein, Economics Editor of Barron's. Thank you for your stirring remarks, Heather.
Thank you.
Question, do you see a problem with policemen's unions? Fellows at the Manhattan Institute have taught us a lot about the problem with teachers' unions. They protect the guilty. Are policemen's unions a similar problem with protecting the guilty?
It varies from place to place. There's some commanders who will say, surprisingly, I was just in Chicago, and Gary McCarthy, who was fired by Emanuel when Emanuel himself should have stepped down, but he actually said he had quite a good relationship with the union there. There's small departments that can be a real problem. You know, the focus of the media is on these things called Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which create a window before the police have to talk to investigators. They can be 24 hours, which they are in Chicago. In some places, they're even longer than that. I'm not, it doesn't shock my conscience that they've got that, a brief window at least, because as even McCarthy told me, after a police shooting, your head is completely screwed up. But it can be hard to get rid of bad officers, but they remain, I think, a very small proportion of the policing force. And I think the bigger problem really is the ideology against them now. They certainly want their pensions, and that's, as the Manhattan Institute well knows, can also be a problem. But as far as the discipline issues, it varies from place to place.
Okay, we have a question here at that table.
Stephen Morse from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Wonderful talk, Heather.
Thank you.
Heather, there's been a massive drop in aggressive stop and frisk in New York City, and yet the crime rate has not gone up as much as the Ferguson effect would predict. Is there something special about New York? And the data from Philadelphia are about the same. So were the cops doing too much?
Well, there is something special about New York, and that's size. It turns out that size matters when it comes to policing. New York has, by magnitudes, a much larger police force on a per capita basis and just in absolute numbers than other departments. And in the first half of 2015, New York City was seeing a very similar spike in homicides and shootings as the rest of the country. And Mayor de Blasio and Bratton were clearly freaking out about this. And I think it was de Blasio who made a comment that everybody pounced on, which is to say, well, the public shouldn't worry because the people being shot are all gangbangers. That didn't go over so well. I mean, that's mostly always the case, although there's always innocent bystanders taken. And as a result of that, the pressure was on because thanks to Rudolph Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg, the standard has now been set for any mayor of New York that you damn well better not let the crime rate go back up. So Bratton basically called every available cop he could get his hands on and flooded high crime zones with them to use command presence, just got their bodies out there. And that influx of manpower, which is something that no other department has the ability to muster, did put a lid on the shootings. But I would say if we had a force of similar proportions to other cities, we'd be still having a problem.
Okay, let's do the one back there and then Michael.
Marshall Jaffe, would you say that it is a prerequisite for a reversal in the political climate regarding the police for increased violent crime to infect more affluent, majority white areas, cities?
Yes.
When's that going to happen?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if I were a Black Lives Matter protester, they really should. This is what they should be protesting about. The media, for all its anti-cop lefty animus, it turns out doesn't really care about Black lives, because there has been just a spurt in Black lives being taken that gets no attention. Chicago, over the weekend, there was somebody shot every 43 minutes. Do we know about this? Imagine if there were white people being shot every 43 minutes. We saw what happened after Newton. All these white parents freaked out, and we have a political trauma. Newton occurs every few months in the black community. And it doesn't get any attention. So yes, what we're seeing in Chicago now, there's been drive-by shootings and robberies on Lakeshore Drive on the Gold Coast. So there, crime is starting to spread. But I completely agree that until this becomes an issue that affects white people, it's not going to get the attention that it deserves.
Michael?
Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. During the heyday of stop and frisk, particularly in New York City, when hundreds of thousands of people were stopped and frisked by the police, most of those people, overwhelming numbers of those people, were not only not because the cops used to say we stopped them because that's what the guns are, but the overwhelming numbers of those people had no guns. And there was a small percentage of people who had a reason that cops would stop them in terms of legal course. Very small percentages, overwhelmingly not, number one. Number two, with respect to the comment of Roy Wilkins, who used to be the executive director of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, when the NAACP was a decent organization. He said, a punk is a punk. A thug is a thug. No need to put black in front of punk. No need to put black in front of thug, because the overwhelming numbers of blacks are law-abiding citizens. So why paint a picture of out of control crime as black? Why paint a picture of young people who are stopped by cops, with or without cause, as being black, when the percentages of those with guns or without guns are wholly innocent?
I'd be so happy to stop talking in racial terms. But as long as those remain the terms that are used by the media, and we hear inevitably about white cops shooting black people, I'm afraid I'm going to have to use that in rebuttal. This is not something that I choose to do. It is the coin of the realm at this point. And, the lies that this is a racial issue is not something that the police have put forward. They will tell you, I don't care if you're green or orange or purple. If you are behaving in such a way to raise my suspicion, I'm going to stop you. Race has nothing to do with it. They are in particular neighborhoods. You can go to a CompStat meeting and they've got extraordinarily sophisticated crime mapping technology now that will target where there are burglary outbreaks, where there are elderly women being robbed on the streets. They don't say anything about race. The dots are the victims. So it's not the police that are racializing this, it is the activists. As for the percentage of people who were innocent of any wrongdoing in the New York, before the Shira Scheindlin, the federal judge, got her hands on the system, the numbers that were always quoted was 12%, 6% of stops resulted in an arrest, 6% resulted in a summons. Therefore, the reasoning went, 88% of all people stopped were completely innocent of any wrongdoing. I reject that logic. It is, drug sets are extremely finely choreographed affairs. And the people engaged in selling drugs know how to distribute the drugs and the money in such a way as to make it very difficult to have probable cause to make an arrest. Nevertheless, when cops are intervening in that, it is sending a message to the people there that they are being watched. If they've got a pattern of cars being stolen from a particular street and the cops see somebody walking along a line of cars trying car door handles, that is not probable cause to make an arrest. But having stopped and questioned that person lets him know that the cops are watching him. And by the way, I use him advisedly because, according to Wes Scogan, a criminologist at Northwestern University who's looked at the Chicago stop and question statistics, the the biggest predictor of getting stopped is not race, it's being a male. Sorry, guys, but you're the ones, if there's profiling going on, it's you. And that's because the male crime rate dwarfs anything that females engage in. So, yes, I cannot dispute, of course, that there were innocent people that are being stopped. But I remember Richard Green from the Crown Heights Collective in the 1960s, in the 1990s, as Giuliani was just getting a hold on shootings in Crown Heights, saying, if the choice is between getting stopped and getting shot, I'll choose getting stopped, which isn't to say, as I say, that it is not a horrifying experience. The solution is not to blame the cops, it's to say, let's figure out a non-policing solution to bring crime down, and the only one that I know of is to reconstitute the family.
Okay, Larry Mead and then Stanley.
Larry Mead from New York University. Heather, you've almost asked my question, which is, obviously it's better to restore active policing than not to, and to get a handle on the shootings, but the ultimate solution isn't that. It's to somehow bring down the very high propensity to crime that we see in poor communities. You say we need to reconstitute the family. Can you think of something less apocalyptic that we might do short of that? Obviously that's true in some sense, but what else can we do? Is there something we can do instead of active policing?
Well, this is equally apocalyptic, as I've learned from a college speaking tour, which is to invoke the Boy Scouts. I was accused, having done so once, as being asked, well, you know, aren't there any government programs that you like for stopping crime? And I said, well, not really government, but here's one. How about the Boy Scouts? So I was accused of being the very embodiment of the intersectionality of homophobia, racism, white privilege, classism, and what else was there? Maybe anti-feminism, I don't know. But I would say, for me, I'm just infatuated with the Boy Scouts. It is a surrogate for fathers. It creates a off-the-shelf ethic of goodness and chivalry and male nobility for inner-city kids. And if you've ever been to an inner-city scout meeting in a basement church in Bushwick, it just breaks your heart at the exquisite beauty of this thing, to see these kids learning how to tie their kerchief, tie knots, salute the flag, in a world that is utterly hostile, and I'm not talking about the ghetto, I'm talking about America, to such values as male nobility. Groups like that, I think, can give boys a reason to join the bourgeois world. But as Kay Heimowitz has written about so eloquently, really have to go back to marriage, because there is a script that most of the males here followed with the expectation of becoming a eligible mate, and it's hard to become a male without that expectation on you, or not a male, but a self-controlled male.
Stanley.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
You never disappoint.
Oh, good. I always worry I will, so thank
Early
you.
in your talk, you mentioned statistics used against the police, and you talked about responding to calls where there's some black perpetrator. How does that work against the police?
I'm sorry, what? I didn't understand the question.
You said most of the calls police respond to, the call is there's a black perpetrator who has a gun or does something. But that results in statistics,
Right,
which
okay.
they use against the
Sure.
cops.
Right. So here's what the ACLU does. They get their hands on police stop data or arrest data. We now, the attack on broken windows policing continues, because the Daily News last summer had this big spread where they got their hands on police data showing that the majority of misdemeanor summonses for quality of life type broken windows offenses were in minority neighborhoods. And they said, well, that must be racism on the part of the cops. They're oppressing low-income neighborhoods with these ridiculous misdemeanor summonses. Well, but that's where they're being asked to maintain order. I have seen many people engaged in illegal vending on 125th Street, less so in other neighborhoods, and the people that live in those areas want that type of policing. And they look at arrests as well. Arrests are disproportionately minority. All of these police activity data is used by the ACLU against a population data rather than crime data. So whether it's even responding to 911 calls or making those stops or responding to public order requests, given where social breakdown and family breakdown is at its most intense, that's going to be in minority neighborhoods, and the police activity in responding to that is used against the cops.
Okay. John Stossel?
Do we lock up the right number of people? We lock up 2.3 million, more than any other country. Tom Cotton says we ought to lock up more because most of the people who do things don't get caught. But it bothers me that America, more than Russia and China, locks up so many people.
Mm-hmm. Well, incarceration rates are going down. I don't know, 2.3 million. I think that's maybe including people that are also under community supervision. But prison today remains a Lifetime Achievement Award for persistence in criminal offending. You have to work very hard to get yourself sentenced to prison. Most offenders get community supervision or jail. Only about a third of convicted felons actually get a prison sentence. The JFA Institute, which is an anti-incarceration group, has estimated that in only 3% of all violent victimizations and property offenses does the criminal end up in prison. Most are never caught, and again, if they are caught, big city district attorneys have no interest in you unless you have engaged in a very serious crime or have a very serious criminal history. If you look at the average number of arrest records and convictions of people in prison, it's about 10 arrests and 5 convictions. So, you know, prison is a squalid, depressing, heart-wrenching affair. I agree. And it would be great if there were alternatives to it that worked. And there's a movement today among criminologists called evidence-based practices, EBP, that is referring to alleged social service programs that serve as alternatives to incarceration. Well, the Justice Department has a website that evaluates these various recidivism, anti-recidivism rehab programs, and it turns out there's very little E for the P. There's little evidence for programs that work. They found 6 recidivism programs that even passed muster to look at, and the Justice Department rated none of them as effective. So it would be great if we had something that worked. But at this point, it is very hard to change character and patterns of offending. Incapacitation does one thing very well, and that's getting the offender off the streets. So I'm not against tweaking like federal drug penalties because all sentences are arbitrary. You know, I'm not going to raise an alarm about moving a crack sentence for dealing crack from 10 years to 8 years, because if it had been 8 years to begin with, nobody would be complaining. So this is all, it's arbitrary. It turns out it's very hard politically to ratchet things down, but you can always ratchet it up. So I would agree with you there. So I'm open to tweaking around the edges. What I think is more dangerous in the current mass incarceration meme that we have Michelle Alexander to thank in her absolutely pernicious and disingenuous book, The New Jim Crow, is not the policy changes, it's the assumptions behind them, which is that the criminal justice system is racist, and that's why we have such large numbers of blacks in prison, and that is just not the case.
Okay. Why don't we have somebody who hasn't asked a question?
Justice Sotomayor, I think in a dissent that came out yesterday, talked about brown and black parents giving the talk, meaning to their children in neighborhoods, not to run down the sidewalk, keep your hands where they can be seen, don't talk back to police officers. And she said it with a certain amount of a lecturing tone. And what struck me as kind of odd was that, you know, middle-class families raise their children to be polite in public, or at least they did in my generation. And that the idea of the talk is just, it's almost meaningless. You didn't have the talk because you were raised to have those and other values.
Right.
And I wonder if this wise Latina is missing something. But this is part of the debate. She cited Michelle Alexander's book, amongst others, in this dissent, and I'm wondering if, you know, there's another side of that coin that seems to be missed, and she's arguing sort of from a rhetorical standpoint than from a deliberative standpoint. I wonder if you had any observations.
Yeah, it's
Michael,
absolutely
did you want to weigh in on this?
I just
Yeah.
wanted to point out an interesting footnote. An interesting footnote to that dissent is that the defendant in that case was white.
It happens. Well, we all need the talk, I think, and you're right. The respect for authority is largely absent throughout society. But if Black Lives Matter movement really wanted to save lives, first, I mean, the big agenda would be stigmatize criminals as energetically and enthusiastically as you stigmatize the police. But another suggestion would be, please persuade people not to resist arrest, because almost all of the highly publicized police shootings in the last 2 years have started with somebody resisting arrest. Now, that doesn't mean that in the case of Walter Scott, say, who was running from the cops, that was at all justified to shoot him in the back. That was a bad, horrific shooting, and the officer is probably rightly going to be found guilty of murder. But generally, I was just in Chicago 3 weeks ago or so and talked to this wonderful bourgeois black guy who works at a bakery, and he said, you know, I see all these kids now cussing at the cops, fussing with them, you know, and I don't do that. He said, I've been stopped for good reason, and I've been treated very respectfully, and I like my job. You know, I don't want to jeopardize it, so I treat the officers with respect, and that would do a great deal to improve things for sure, and minimize the bad shootings. You know, I don't think people really know the numbers. Given the Black Lives Matter movement, you would think that there would have been like hundreds of allegedly unarmed black males who've been shot. Well, last year I did an analysis. There were 36 unarmed black males who were shot fatally by the police compared to 31 unarmed white males shot by the police. Out of, I think there's about 18 million black males in the country. But most of those that were categorized by the Washington Post as unarmed were in fact trying to grab the officer's gun or fighting with him or otherwise putting that officer in fear for his life. So, you know, if you're grabbing an officer's gun like Michael Brown, that officer kind of gets to assume that you intend to use it. And that happens not infrequently out there.
I think we're going to wrap it up there because we want to get Heather out, but you're going to be hearing more from her and more about this book. So please join me in thanking her.